We have the pleasure to host this event today, which is part of the Geneva Democracy Week, an initiative which is promoted by the Geneva Chancellery of State every year during the first week of October, and our center is pleased to be an active partner. So this gives us the opportunity also to explore some of the key themes on which our center is working. And this year, as the overarching theme of the Democracy Week, we have identified the theme of democracy in transition. So our center and the different partners are organizing events, activities in Geneva on this theme. And we are very happy to host this panel discussion today, which explores the various modalities and implications of the transition, the digital transition, and the implications on work and on democracy. So this is also very close to the activities that our center has been developing with my colleague Maria Mexi, our research pillar on transformation of work, inequalities and solidarities. So you might also be following some of these activities on the center's different channels. We have a commentary series going on. We have also a podcast series that we launched a few weeks ago that you can follow also on the center's website. So we are really happy and honored also to be able to partner with a number of colleagues and organizations and universities tonight. And I will leave Maria introduce all the panelists. And as a keynote speaker, we have the pleasure to have our colleague Adzita Berra-Awad, who is joining remotely. And we thank you very much for her availability of giving the keynote address tonight. So Adzita is the former director at the ILO Employment Policy Department, and she's the chair of the board of UNDRIS, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And she's also the director of policy at the Global Labor Organization. So we will leave you, Adzita, give the keynotes. After that, Maria will moderate the panel discussion with our colleagues. So this event is a hybrid event, as now is the usual practice. So we have also colleagues, students, and the audience joining online. So there will be the discussion involving the audience here in the room at the Grad Institute, but also online. So for information, this event is recorded and it will be available on the Grad Institute's YouTube channel. So for those who are joining online, you will be able to ask your questions or share your comments by using the chat box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. Even during the talk, during the presentations, we are eager to have you also joining. So very warm welcome to the panelists, to the audience here in Geneva and joining remotely. And I leave the floor to Adzita, thanking her very much for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for this very generous introduction. It's indeed a privilege for me well.
Yes. Yes.
So I should want to just. It's indeed a privilege for me to participate in this event organized at the Graduate Institute by the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. I really do regret, though, that I could not participate in person. Work transition, social contract, and democracy raise complex set of questions that interact in multiple ways. In this brief talk, I will certainly not be able to do justice to all the array of conceptual and analytic issues, nor to give many examples of the diversity of realities in different parts and for different parts of the world and for different groups of people. I will highlight instead a more macro and global picture of work transitions, and basically I want to make 2 points. First, that while digital technologies are so pervasively transforming our patterns of work and life, I wish to emphasize that there are multiple other transitions that have been at work over the last decades that shape the labor market outcomes that we see today, the meaning of work, and the way humanity and society organize and share the fruits of work. Second point I wish to make is the importance of the moment and the juncture we live through, and the juncture we are having this conversation, and how much the nature of debate has shifted, not least because of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are no ordinary times. A lot of uncertainties are being eroded. Anxiety about the future of work, future of the planet is running high. More significantly, there are not many alternative, liberating narratives or utopian models that galvanize hope, energy, and trust, and replace fear with dreams for the future. Disappointment from work, whether caused in terms of scarcity of opportunity to access meaningful, stable, and decent work, insecurity of returns and incomes, inadequate conditions of work for large swaths of the populations in the global north and global south play a large part in this overall picture of uncertainty, socioeconomic insecurity, and mistrust in policies and institutions. We all know too well how these grievances are impacting the political systems, weakening democracies, instrumentalized by populist movements and demagogic discourse. Before the COVID-19 pandemic became the planetary concern as we know it, debate on future of work among academia, policy actors, and media focused primarily on the potential job destruction and job replacement effects of robotics, AI, and a number of other technologies. However, the technology-centered future of work debate neglected or underplayed what in my view is a key dimension: the policies, institutions, and governance frameworks, in short, the context in which these technologies are introduced. Frameworks which also determine the pace of their adoption and ultimately their exclusionary or inclusionary impact. The rapid growth of digital labor platforms, crowd work, online web-based, and some other types of location-based platforms, such as Uber and food delivery services, are generating a host of new problematic issues. Let me pick 3. The blurring in status of dependent worker or self-employed, which has many implications for establishing responsibilities and liabilities related to an employment relationship. Second point, the use of algorithms in some of these crowd work or micro-task platforms to assess human work performance and use across multiple countries questions even further the role of humans and humanity in this work relationship. So the machine is not only replacing the human worker, but also to some extent the managerial role. And of course, more importantly, the third aspect, the void of agreed and negotiated governance rules, where engagement modalities are unilaterally determined by platform owners. In my view, therefore, the real disruptive transition in work and world of work-related governance started much earlier, in the mid-70s, with the rapid spread of what is called now hyperglobalization and the neoliberal economic policies that sustained it. The fragmentation of production system and different business functions along global value chains operating across many different national jurisdictions has transformed radically the international division of labor and the profit-sharing structure. This transformation was sustained by liberalization of trade and financial and investment policies that favored countries with least taxation and labor regulation and protection, which in turn created the dynamics that we all have heard of, the race to the bottom. This new policy framework that has been successfully by and large disseminated across the globe structurally weakened the post-World War II governance consensus in the world of work that was based on cooperation amongst the three parties, government, employers, and workers, to negotiate and bargain for fair sharing in growth and in productivity gains, including those accruing from technological developments. A consensus on strategies and governance rules that could pursue in tandem economic growth, full employment, worker protection, welfare provision, and improved living standards, a model that delivered for a good part in Western democracies during the 30 golden years, or what has been labeled les 30 glorieuses in French, and held the same promise of similar trajectory of convergence over time in the global South. Today, there is a shared diagnostic among social scientists, including economists of all streams. And the phenomenon is so rare that I really want to underscore that, a shared diagnostic, that globalization policies of the last 3 decades, by and large, have not delivered on jobs, neither regarding employment levels, quantity of employment, nor with respect to the quality of jobs, the stability of incomes, and conditions of work. The fault lines of gender, race, ethnicity, education, age at both extremes, young and old, show that for a large number of people, work is not playing as it did and as it should its inclusionary and redistributive function and the promise of social upward mobility within and across generations. There is a plethora of factual evidence to illustrate these trends. Let me mention only 2. First is the labor income share in total income that has been on a declining trend in spite of major labor productivity gains accrued in the same period of hyperglobalization. This trend is a major contributor to the rise in extreme income inequalities that we are observing, and in contrast with the direction of this trend prior to this era of hyperglobalization. The second indicator that I want to highlight is informality. Today, those working and producing in the informal economy account for over 62% of the global workforce, with no or limited access to development opportunities and protections that accrue to formal work and business operations. The phenomenon of informality, you will recall, for many decades was associated with developing country conditions, but it is re-emerging, including in advanced economies and including in digital gig economy. Better than indicators, I would like to borrow a metaphor widely used to illustrate the fragmented world of work that we have. Islands of productive, high-wage activities in a sea of poor jobs and pockets of unemployment. This picture holds true for the global North and the global South, with all the variations and nuances of geography, culture, and policies that should be borne in mind to qualify the local realities. While all the range of these new technological developments, including much decried robotics and AI, have the potential to create more jobs and to promote more inclusive labor markets and societies, it is readily apparent that the new generation of digital technologies introduced in this highly polarized and competitive context that I have very summarily depicted will only strengthen the polarization trends of wealth, market, and power concentration. Let me now turn to some good news, because there is, and I think that understanding the moment is also about appreciating how the conversation has shifted since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic, with all its deleterious impact on health, work, and life, has had this positive income that by exposing in a flagrant and undisputable manner the structural inequalities that pre-existed COVID-19 has been compelling reflection on the drivers and causes of these widening social inequalities. It is at the same time giving a higher moral imperative to the public demand for fairer and more sustainable societies. From different corners, calls abound to revisit and renew the social contract. Interestingly, these calls, publications, initiatives arise from so many different sources: academia, civil society, but governments, private sector, major corporations, as well as small enterprises, unions, international organizations, not only those who have social mandate and develop sustainable development in their core of their mandate, but also mainstream financial institutions that have been sustaining a different policy package. So understanding the moment for me is also about the positive burgeoning of ideas and proposals and announcements, the building blocks of a new social contract. Some ideas are not new, have been around for some time, but have regained much in vigor and are making their ways into policy. Naturally, the renewal of social contract means different things to different people. In the new policy discourse and debate, however, that we are witnessing, there is a higher recognition of the systemic nature of vulnerabilities and the central focus on transitions in work and its governance infrastructure. The unprecedented efforts in financial terms, as well as in scope of operations, that the rescue and recovery programs in response to COVID's impact on jobs and on the economy have shown, it itself has shown that the range of policy options and the possibility in particular of breaking through some of what was considered policy taboos in the previous decades, such as on the role of the state and regulatory frameworks, the limits on public debt or taxation, domestic, international, and so on. It would be impossible to go through all what is on the table. Let me mention in a very random order the proposals that include antitrust regulation, to policy frameworks for incentivizing investment for transition to low carbon economy, investments in the care economy through global funding mechanisms, two areas which have high job creation potential and high social returns. Among other ideas, basic universal income, universal health insurance coverage, very much the reinvigorating social economy and social entrepreneurship, but also redefining in this discourse the contours and the space for participatory local democracy. Conspicuously, however, there is not enough innovation, in my view, with respect to youth. The majority of proposals concern education and skills development. And while policies and strategies to promote equal opportunities to access education, high quality education and skills development, including for overcoming the digital divide, is a necessary condition. It is not sufficient to overcome the major transitional gaps and limbo that youth are facing today. The 2007-8 global financial crisis showed how the nature and the pathways of school-to-work transitions have changed, became more difficult with uncertain outcomes, including for the educated youth. After a decade only, youth have been particularly and more severely hit by the COVID-19 crisis in their education, jobs, incomes, and psychological health. And by now, it is well established, we have enough studies that show that young women and men entering the labor markets in times of crisis endure long-term scarring impacts in terms of quality of jobs, their career path, and the wages. It is also interesting to note that in the demands that were voiced by youth in the waves of youth protests during the Arab uprising a decade ago, and since those protests that regularly happen in other places in different regions, the quests for freedom, rights, and decent work were very much intertwined. This is also corroborated by numerous studies, surveys, opinion polls on youth transitions that reveal the extent to which, in youth perceptions and expectations, the issues of work, rights, space for civic engagement, and political participation are intertwined. At a time that youth are showing their incredible convening and mobilization power for the planet and environmental transition, any renewed social contract should make a larger space for supporting youth on multiple transition, but also for engaging their critical and constructive thinking in influencing the governance norms, the ethics of this massive and concomitant transformation in the world of work. Let me end this note by throwing a few questions. And obviously, I am not going to answer them, but will this extraordinary moment be seized? Will the changes of mindset or policy paradigms endure the crisis response? Is the pendulum swinging towards rehabilitating the objectives of full employment and of strategies and institutions that could diffuse more broadly and fairly the higher productivity achieved through technology? Will the values of social justice and just transitions, human-centered or human in command, shape the new economic, social, and political model? And the biggest challenge of all, how the models of social democracy and political democracy can be retooled, trusted in today's fraught social, media, and political environment. Will these changes impose themselves through leadership, multilateral cooperation, or through more crisis and social upheavals, and probably a combination of both? Thank you, Maria, I hope I didn't extend the time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Azita. We're very grateful for this very insightful speech covering actually everything, the factors, the consequences, the responses, the types of changes occurring and affecting the world of work. Let me first introduce our panelists, and then we can comment on the topics addressed so far. So I would like to thank also Christine for her introduction today, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this discussion. I just want to say that before I introduce our panelists, that we have very purposefully and intentionally put together a very multidisciplinary panel.
Very male.
Sorry. Composed actually of experts and academics coming from different disciplines and backgrounds, from political science, environmental science, sociology, and economics. And actually from the policy community, Kostas Papadakis representing the International Labour Organization and Zita as well, and also from academia. And we wanted to do that because we wanted to reflect the diversity of factors and of changing pertaining to the world of work, and actually the multiple intersecting trends occurring these days. So I'm very delighted to present to you our panelists. With us we have, joining remotely from Parma, Simone Baglioni, professor at the Department of Economics Management at the University of Parma. With us also we have Samuel Prolesauer, doctoral student at the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Bern and former research analyst at UNRISD. Felipe Calvao, Associate Professor at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at the Graduate Institute and Faculty Associate to the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. We will be joined by Alexander Hedzazi from the University of Geneva in a couple of minutes from now, hopefully. And with us we also have Kostas Papadakis, Senior Social Dialogue and Governance Specialist at the International Labour Organization. So thank you all for accepting our invitation today. Azita, as I said, in her keynote speech, very insightfully said all the key themes. She discussed issues. She told us what she told us. She told us that what is happening today is about transition in plural, not just transition. It's about the impacts of globalization, macro level forces and jobs. It's about the juncture, the specific period we are living in today, and also about the need to revive the social contract, especially in the face of increasing inequalities and particularly affecting the youth. And ultimately, as Zita stressed, it's about how we can strengthen our labor market institutions and our democratic mechanisms as a kind of safeguard against disruptions, and particularly digital disruptions. So drawing on this very important point, I would like to start off with Felipe Calvao, who has done a lot of work on the digital work, actually. A lot of research on the digital work, and especially algorithms, a topic that also Zita mentioned in her speech. So, Felipe, the floor is yours. How do you see the changes occurring? What is your take on the change occurring, and what do you consider key challenges and opportunities?
Should I turn my mic on, or?
Yes, maybe it's better for the recording.
I don't even know if it's working. Is it on? Okay. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It gives me great pleasure to join this important conversation today. And I think it's one of the critical questions of our days. To what extent is indeed the world of work changing, and where do we see different kinds of challenges and opportunities? I humbly accept the introduction. Although it's still a work in progress, I'm still conducting research on some of these topics. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, I think we need to start with an obvious observation that there is a break in the kind of social contract between labor and capital, in that we are witnessing a kind of deviation from work that is or has been secure, that provides a certain kind of livelihood, lifestyle, and identity towards what has been called an unprecedented mode of exploitation in this late capitalism of our days. So work that's flexible, that's contingent, that's irregular, uncertain, unpredictable, and ultimately risky in various different ways. Seen from different parts of the global south, where I've been conducting most of my research, this world of work has been already very precarious for many, many years. And in that sense, I try to, instead of assessing sort of the situation today, I try to anticipate a bit what the future of work will look if we take this vantage point from the global south, where work is increasingly mediated by these large global technology platforms and governed indeed by automatic algorithms. So this relationship between machines and humans in a computer-mediated economy, if we can call it that, has been the object of heightened attention over the last few years, but I think we're still led to speculate on what will be the actual effects and impacts of digitalization in the global south. So this is my modest contribution to that debate, in which I try to suggest that workers in these countries are indeed stepping ever closer to experiencing the impact of automated and digitally enabled work. And this is in part in light of the demise of the formal sector in a lot of these countries, if it was ever such a thing, and the fast adoption of digital technologies, very much shored up by a fairly robust access to cheap communication or data communication networks. And this fast adoption of digital technology is particularly visible in the ride-sharing app business, which has been the main locus of my research in sub-Saharan Africa and in India. In Africa alone, you have around 60 competing ride-sharing services spread across 21 countries. So part of this material that I'm sort of just briefly glossing over today builds from my about 130 interviews conducted with different Uber drivers and other ride-sharing apps across Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Ghana, and Nigeria, where revealingly enough, a lot of these interviewees are far older, at least, than previously suggested, i.e. above 30 years of age, far more educated, and interestingly enough, heralding much more from the formal sector in higher numbers, again, than had been previously suggested. So I just want to identify 3 symptoms of this transformation in the world of work. And Maria, please stop me if I extend the purview of my time. But this, again, at the risk of sounding repetitive, we've heard this before. The first symptom would be the existence of non-standard employment as defined by the ILO, work that is not full-time, that's indefinite, or underpinned by a long-term bilateral employment relationship. In which the workers' apparent freedom ends up being undermined by the control and surveillance exerted by these companies' imposition of so-called algorithmic governance. Second symptom is the shift from a time rate system of wage payments towards task-based incomes, most notoriously in these ride-sharing apps, but across the gig economy, where there's an attendant importance of so-called reputational capital for workers that are devoid of any other kind of form of protection. Thirdly, though accountable for their own means, their own equipment, thus shifting the responsibility of ensuring the necessary means of production towards the workers themselves, these workers depend, and I think this is a particularly important point, on the technological brokerage of these technology platforms to access the labor market through labor platforms managed by algorithms. And it has been demonstrated that these technological platforms demonstrated and have produced a series of information asymmetries that are generated by algorithmic operations. So I've been talking a bit about algorithms, so let me just elaborate for a couple of minutes, if I'm allowed, on the problems of algorithms. We've all heard to some extent on algorithms. These are lines of code written by machines and humans designed to calculate, solve problems, provide instructions for computers and automated processes. But for millions of people across the world, for all of us in this room, the algorithm has become an inevitable, if inscrutable, fact of life. From self-driving cars to medical diagnosis, weather forecasting, information access, labor management, education, the list could go on. Algorithms have seeped into everyday experiences as a cornerstone of production, but also reproduction of life. And I think for the last decade or so, algorithms have come to shape workers' behavior, consumer attitudes, impose new forms of surveillance and monitoring, and in the process, they blur the distinction between economic and social life, and in the process, prompt questions and debates about the future of work. So more than mere computational objects that redefine productive processes, algorithms are increasingly imbricated in human collectives. They are increasingly politically salient and ever more present in very intimate spheres of everyday life. And while research on algorithms has focused on the kinds of invisible structures that govern their deployment, as well as the concealment, for example, of human contribution to data processing or other forms of digitally enabled work, as well as labor management and so-called techno-mediated impact of algorithms as an opaque and reified black box, this scholarship has primarily documented how humans are shaped, disciplined, and controlled by computerized algorithms in what has been called sort of the prefiguring of a coming age of a robocracy, where a new exploitative division of labor, where human and computerized interactions would have their own cognitive models and forms of rationality. However, the effects of algorithms on the relation between machines and humans are not felt equally everywhere, in as much as their disciplining effects are not necessarily a new historical phenomenon. And yet the last decade of algorithmic powered technological transformation and their insidious influence in everyday life brings, I think, added urgency to research, which again has been chiefly concerned with mechanisms of control, deliberate processes to obscure these algorithmic processes, and the imposition of new forms of alienation and isolation, also gendered and racialized exploitation. And I want to conclude maybe thinking about the future of work and the opportunities that lie ahead of us by offering an alternative orientation towards this technological artifact that can possibly escape the kinds of determinism of algorithms and instead shed a critical light on novel and potentially emancipatory social relationships that lie behind algorithmic operations, if you will, cracking open and giving rise to modes of revealing the black box of algorithms. So I'll leave you with three questions, which I'm mobilizing in my research, and maybe I'll have a chance to come back to it once we have a second round, which is, what would it mean to seize the algorithm conceptually, ethnographically, and politically? And politically, I mean it explicitly so. It has been one of the demands in some workers across the world to actually take control over the algorithm. Secondly, how can we illuminate new forms of human labor and living matter that lie at the heart of algorithms? And thirdly, what forms of innovation, of creativity are engendered by humans' engagement with these digital artifacts? So although depending on the technological brokerage of these firms and platforms to access the labor market, I think this form of digitally mediated and the responses to algorithmic powered work may offer an example of how labor can actually be valorized somewhere in between the very dehumanizing experiences, but also the desire for human autonomy and flexibility. So I will leave it at that. I try to focus on the algorithms. There's plenty more that we could talk about. Maybe in the second round, we can develop some of these ideas.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Philippe. Without doubt, this is a very interesting domain of research. I'm keeping some points here. The growth of non-standard employment within the context of digital platforms and the gig economy, the fragmentation of jobs, the rise of task-based incomes, and the incidence of labor exploitation, which actually, it's because of algorithms, it becomes more intense. But I think that we couldn't say that these are new phenomena. These are phenomena that now characterize the digital economy, but also the so-called analog economy. And we have seen this phenomena experienced by groups like migrants, and Simone Baglioni has worked a lot in the area of labor market, of labor migration and the situation of migrant workers in European labor markets. So I would like to give the floor now to Simone, joining from Parma. Simone is the coordinator of the so-called Sirius project, studying labor migration in Europe, a project that just completed, and it has been widely acknowledged and praised by European Commission officials as a best practice project. So congratulations, Simone, for that. And please, the floor is to you to elaborate on these insights.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm sorry to be able not to be there and to join from Parma, but I have teaching commitment. But I'm very happy to be here. And I was really pleased to listen to the keynote speech and to the contribution on algorithms. I'd like to pick up actually a couple of issues that were brought in by, as you said, Maria, by the comprehensive intervention of Azita, and thinking and linking actually this what she said with what Christine invited us to think about at the beginning, when Christine mentioned the fact that we are part of a series of events discussing and thinking about democracy, and in this case, thinking about democracy and work, and thinking obviously about democracy and the evolution of work in the terms that have just been mentioned, also in terms of the digitalization processes and so on and so on. And while listening to Zita and thinking to our own research, you mentioned the Sirius project, I was thinking that Zita said that 62% of the global work is occurring in the informal economy. We have also investigated in the Sirius project labor migration, and we've seen that many of third country nationals, as we call them in Europe, that are migrants that come from outside Europe, are also engaged or do find a job for the living informally, so they join the informal labor market. And I think this has many forms of consequences that we can discuss and we are aware of, related with their well-being, with the level of salaries. But here we speak about democracy, isn't it? So I just wanted to point out the connection that exists between the share and the importance that the informal economy and informal work has in terms of democracy participation. I think we all agree on the fact that there is no democracy without citizens and without citizenship. But if you are a foreign worker or let's say an immigrant joining the labor market informally, your capacity to be part of your host country citizenship is extremely reduced. I would say even perhaps dramatically reduced. So you may have the chance to take part to a country, let's say life through civil society organizations or through other forms of engagement, but not being able to join legally the labor market would curtail your rights in terms of, for example, social entitlements and social security, as I said, decent salary, your rights as a worker, and your rights finally as a human being. So there's a sort of an attack to our democracy, which is going on since decades, and which we pretend to ignore, and to which we just look at the dimensions that are related with the functioning of the economy. It needs irregular forms of employment, with the let's say momentaneous functioning of the informal market for those who need a job and an immediate salary, but we lose the bigger framework in which we really live in societies for which so we call them democracies, but on which the full entitlement of rights and therefore full citizenship applies to a small portion of those who live and contribute to these democracies. So maybe we should also think about the share of the informal economy and the formal labor market in terms of damages to democracy, as I've just said, for its connection to the citizenship. Then obviously the other reason I wanted to mention is that for most of the migrants, for example, the option is not a deliberate choice of joining the informal economy, but is a consequence of the reduced opportunities that European countries do deploy for third country nationals to gain decent a decent job and a regular job in our countries. One of the things I wanted to put forward and to put it in the table for discussion this afternoon was, trying to together to dismantle some of the myths of globalization. Maybe one of the biggest, or if not the biggest myth, is that we live in a global mobile world. Well, we have learned since, I would say, some time that mobility is an asset which doesn't come alike for everybody, but which comes in different shapes. People have to somehow afford mobility, and we do not afford mobility all alike. I can afford mobility. I have been a migrant worker in the so-called high-skilled domain for most of my life, working in Switzerland, and then until recently for 10 years in the UK. But this isn't an option for many of the migrants I've been interviewing in the past almost 4 years, because the asset of mobility is really, let's say, difficult to seize and to manage in our society. One of the issues which make it more difficult is the legal, what we call the legal framework of migration. How do we, let's say, accommodate legally migrants in our societies? And we have a plethora of ways to accommodate migrants in our society, which make our societies a sort of, I want to give you a figurative image of an accordion in which you might have, the capacity to benefit of your mobility asset entirely as a legal, regular, employed, for example, migrant, which enjoys most of the rights and benefits, and do even participate to the full citizenship, in some country even political citizenship at local level, for example, while in other, the accordion is much smaller at the point that you don't have, as I said before, much choice than joining the labor market informally. Let's just take one example. If you are an asylum seeker, as we all know, you don't have the right to work immediately. In most of the European countries, you will have to wait for an important amount of time before being able to join the labor market. So the first basic rights, can I work, am I entitled to work, is for migrants curtailed since they enter the country, or they have to wait a very long amount of time. And I don't want to be tedious now and to go on all the different typologies that we have built up in Europe in terms of legal statuses, providing, the various shades to which you can participate to the labor market. But this is something which is really actually touching upon the everyday life of people. I mentioned the fundamental right, the right to work, but then there are cognate rights that are as equally, I would say, important, because it's important to give people the right to work, right? We all agree on that, but if you do not recognize people's skills, educational achievements in their home countries, the accordion goes, again, very narrow, in the sense that people can join the labor market, seizing the opportunities that these provide them, which in many cases do not correspond to their skills, to their educational achievements. And so they have to start their employment life and career from scratch with a huge brain waste and talent waste, and a huge also increase in demotivation, but also a huge loss for our societies, in which we have several sectors of our economy with unfilled vacancies. So there's really, a situation, a policy situation, which doesn't consider the opportunities that we could actually deploy for newcomers to better accommodate in our society and join, therefore, a full status of citizenship. The other issue, I don't know if I have another minute, but I will continue in the second slot eventually. The other thing that I wanted to point out to dismantle the mythology of globalization is related with the other mantra of globalization, which is flexibility. And we have learned that people need to be flexible to obviously too much employers and capitalism needs. We've extended flexibility at maximum. It was just mentioned when speaking about the gig economy. But going back to my field of study, labor migration, what we use for labor migration, as I just said, mentioning the juridical and legal status categories, is the opposite of flexibility. And therefore, people that enter a country with a humanitarian permit or a refugee status are not entitled in most of European countries to change that into a long-term working permit once they gain a job. And this has tremendous consequences on people's capacities and chances and opportunities to keep working and living a more than decent life in the new country of settlement. And therefore, we pretend from specific categories of people the opposite of flexibility, a fixed status which really, enchain people for years and years for various reasons that we can discuss later on. Therefore, I think that for the future, going back to your question, I think the future of work would need to address some of these issues in order for, before the social contract was mentioned, before, let's say, we can expect a different and better social contract to be forged, and also in order for our societies to live in democracies that are, let's say, closer in their empirical evidence to what democracy really means, in particular, having in mind the meaning of citizenship. And I'll stop here. Anna.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you a lot. Quite many points. Precarity, flexibility, and the interplay between flexibility and mobility. The ILO has worked a lot in the area of promoting decent work opportunities and fair globalization. Kostas, how do you see things? How do you see in relation of, since you have worked in the area, especially of social dialogue at the ILO for many years now, how do you see things evolving?
Well, Maria, thank you. Basically, first of all, just to say that I don't know if I can say much after all these interventions, which has been extremely comprehensive and complementary. Now, how do I see things evolving? I think the ILO has traditionally, emphasized both the opportunities and the challenges associated with, the challenges of the evolving world of work. But since we're a little bit late in the evening here, let me, before addressing these opportunities and challenges, I have selected 3 for each. Let me tell you a story which is very recent, and which involves the Greece's largest food delivery service, which is an app, a mobile app, which was extensively used, especially during the successive lockdowns in Greece. This mobile application allows some 4,000 people to work, to have a job, and to maintain an income, including during the tough pandemic crisis. So it's a booming industry in Greece, especially this application. So less than a month ago, some of the drivers, some 120 drivers, received a message which I translated for you in English, and I would like to read it to you because I think it's illustrative both of the challenges and the opportunities. So, dear rider, in the context of the productivity increase of our fleet of drivers and of the broader strategy of the company, we would like to ask you to participate in the scheme of collaboration freelancing. We wish to continue our collaboration with you, but according to the above and based on your badge are, the ratings the drivers receive, we estimate that it would be better for you to work as a freelancer. You will have the flexibility to shape your own working hours and increase your income. Alternatively, we would like to inform you that there is no possibility of renewal of the existing contract. I think this message is illustrative of both the opportunities and the challenges. Why? Well, no doubt, digital labor platforms facilitate access to jobs. I mean, including during crisis periods. At the same time, no doubt, platforms help business to adapt, including to new situations. During the pandemic, we have all used a food delivery service. I mean, business, especially small and medium businesses, survive thanks to these services. They manage to continue delivering their services and their products to clients. They facilitate access to jobs, including for people that have limited mobility, for instance, or for women. And having been in parts of the world which are in a war situation, I can tell you that these applications are even used by people that cannot escape borders because of war situations, because of they cannot migrate elsewhere. So that is an opportunity for them. And I think your research, Felipe, has mapped this situation better than the ILO. And at the same time, if the whole concept of, telework, gig economy, etc., it is true that it can be an option for balancing work and private life. Especially, for instance, if we work as freelancers and this is an important nuance, if this is a matter of free choice, okay? If this is not a matter of free choice, and this leads me to the three challenges I would like to emphasize, we tend to be trapped into jobs which are not only, should not be defined only as non-standard forms of employment, but I would say precarious jobs, involving indecent incomes, a lack of social protection, a lack of opportunities to accessing rights, including freedom of association and collective bargaining rights. Now, again, I would like to emphasize three challenges which have already been mentioned. Digital labor platforms risk further blurring the employment relationships because precisely often workers can be categorized as self-employed and freelancers. In reality, they are not. This in turn, this is the second challenge, may deprive workers for accessing social protection, occupational safety and health standards, freedom of association, again, as I said before, and of course, what Felipe also mentioned before, algorithmic management. Algorithmic management can be extremely problematic, and this lack of transparency, including in the example which I gave you, that was a decision of an algorithm to, in reality, to transform the contracts of these people into freelance contracts. These algorithms also create a challenge for the management of the businesses because just to finish the story, what happened in the end with this company is that there was a huge mobilization, both of the trade unions and of users, which when they find it, the press described it as a blackmail of workers. Either you accept a freelance contract or you are fired, especially during this crisis period. And eventually what happened is that due to this protest and mobilization and a special campaign created by young users created an entire campaign, the #cancel this company. The rating of this company went from 5 stars to 1 star. In a matter of few days. And of course, the company was obliged to retire the message and the offer, and even to announce the regularization with contracts without limit of time for 2,000 of their workers. So we see here the importance of protest and mobilization in a context where, unfortunately, the law is either not well interpreted or absent. Or does not do properly job in terms of regulating this kind of indecent, let's say, situations. Yeah, that is a little bit what I would like to say, at least as a first observation, and then I think one thing we have to emphasize, but will perhaps be elaborate this during the second round, the role of the state, the role of regulation, the role of international cooperation.
Okay, excellent. But good point. So, Samuel, can digital social cooperatives be the alternative to the conventional type of digital platforms that we know now? And, social solidarity economy, you have worked a lot in this area. They are characterized by promoting more democratic governance and participatory decision-making. What do you think?
Thank you very much. Also for me, it's a very humbling and a great honor to be here to share this panel with all of you. I'm really curious for the second round that we're going to have now, and I actually also was thinking to perhaps look at possibilities such as the digital social economy, the digital SSE, as ways to address some of these issues that we've been talking about. But maybe just let me very briefly also introduce where I see the key challenges and opportunities. And I think indeed we have, especially at the beginning, we have put a lot of focus on the challenges, right? But always, of course, because it seems so often with digital technology, especially, that the opportunities are just so abundant. And so there's very maybe a little need to reiterate those. But I think we see we see it in many facets, right? How basically a same effect, a transition in one aspect can often bring challenges and opportunities at the same time. Let's think about digital technology as like during the last 1.5 years, how many of us have maybe benefited, have really much enjoyed working remote work, for instance. So I think we can certainly attribute to digital work the creation of better jobs. Certainly there's also better services. At the same time, there can also be very much worse jobs through digital technology, such as created by strong surveillance mechanism by employers and so on. Digital technology or technology more broadly can also reduce work, can reduce the time that we actually need to spend working. So we might enjoy more free time, and at the same time, as is basically the other side of the same coin, there might as well just be fewer jobs and fewer income opportunities. There might as well, through remote work, I mean, one of the major benefits, we've before heard about migration and the ability to afford mobility. There may not so much be a need to afford mobility in such a context if you can basically provide your services from the other side of the world through digital technology, right? So again, this may be a huge opportunity that we can see, but also so this better access and inclusion of jobs might as well also basically evolve into a different situation where jobs can be relocated and only skilled jobs actually persist. So I just basically want to emphasize how in many of these developments that we associate with digital technology and with technological innovations, there's often the questions rather of like how can we avoid some of those challenges, but rather how can we manage challenges while also leveraging the opportunities that the very same mechanisms basically bring. And I think this is one of the main difficulties in this topic, that and also I think especially in the context of what I think is a crisis of governance as well, in the sense that the main established forms of control of governance as we have been utilizing in order to manage the challenges and to benefit from the opportunities are also facing specific crises. I'm going to mention first competition among companies, among market participants in digital technology. As we all know, there are specific network effects, multi-sided network effects specifically, which basically lock in financially powerful companies typically into a very, very strong incumbent position from which it is extremely difficult to get them out from. So we have competition often does not work. So we have one powerful actor in a national context or even in a global context, as we can see it with the few Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and so forth. Apart from competition, there's of course also regulation. Regulation has supported us in the past and is still, of course, extremely important, but is also suffering from important deficiencies in regulating, in actually addressing these issues. I'm specifically mentioning, I think, the ability of regulations to not only manage the challenges, but also indeed to leverage the opportunities. Specifically thinking about antitrust, as we've heard before, and maybe in response to the market competition. If, let's say, the main benefit of Facebook is that everybody of us is on Facebook, antitrust doesn't really work. Antitrust would basically require that these huge monopolies, these huge companies be broken up. But with that very measure, we would also lose a lot of the benefits. So basically there seems to be, at least through regulations, through antitrust regulation specifically, not really a means to retain the benefits and the opportunities oftentimes while actually addressing all the issues that are resulting from the centralized control of these technologies. Finally, and I'm happy that Kostas is here because he's much more knowledgeable about this, I also think social dialogue is, as a third option alongside competition and regulation, very much in a crisis in these to address a lot of these issues, in basically because a lot of production processes have been fragmented in global value chains, but also we see that also in a local context, let's say delivery workers, as we have just heard. I mean, the example of the Greek unions who are mobilizing to support these workers, this is, I'm extremely, it's extremely positive, I think, to see how this has been going on. But we also know that it is not always the case. The trade unions also have a very strong tradition of basically protecting workers in the formal economy much more. Deliveroo and Uber workers had a very hard time when these issues first came up to basically get the support from established trade unions, because they were considered the actual competition. They were considered the threat to the established workers in the textile industries. So again, competition, regulation, and social dialogue all seem to be facing some issues or only provide incomplete answers to the challenges that we're facing, while also not really providing so many answers to how we can actually use all those beautiful opportunities that are being provided. And I think the digital social economy can actually address a lot of these things, but I think I'm going to save that part for the second round.
And what about social dialogue, Kostas? Can be a promising tool for creating more inclusive labor markets and workplaces.
Yes. I think, first of all, the notions of fairness, inclusiveness, and democracy are interrelated notions. Okay, and from my perspective, but I believe from an ILO perspective, I would dare to say also. Now, how can we boost these notions of inclusiveness and fairness, and what will be the role of social dialogue? I think there are three elements which we have to keep in mind when it comes to addressing the question. First of all, the role of national legislation. Second, precisely the role of participatory governance, in this case, social dialogue, in shaping and, let's say, helping shape policies and regulation. And the third is that of international cooperation and perhaps also cross-border social dialogue. Now, let me elaborate on each of these elements. On the role of national regulation, what I said before, the role of the state, I think what is important to emphasize is that we need indeed modernized labor law legislation. That is in order to capture the new developments in the world of work. And these regulations should not only clarify the employment relationship and also be protective of those that do not have the so-called formal employment relationship. They need also to address a number of gaps in the labor administrations. For instance, today, labor inspectorates are not ready to inspect what a gig worker is doing, I mean, his workplace, etc., which is by definition practically impossible. The same with telework, if we talk more broadly about the digitization. So, and of course, not to mention again the importance of having a labor legislation which is protective, which is promoting social protection of all workers independently of the status of the worker. Now, going to your question, Marily, social dialogue. Well, you know, from an ILO perspective, when decisions affect certain category of workers, people more broadly, these people should be involved in the policy-making process by expressing a view, by shaping actually the policy and regulation, and this is what we call actually social dialogue. Okay, so information, consultation, or exchange of information between workers, employers, and governments. Now, during the pandemic, there have been some interesting steps forward. For instance, in Italy, we have the first national sectoral collective agreement covering gig workers in the food delivery sector. And that's an interesting agreement because it's a detailed one. It talks even about the levels of hour wages by hour, so salary per hour. It covers also other questions such as special allowances, like if a food delivery, a driver, let's say, is working during holidays, etc., etc., etc. So this is one of the most interesting and first sectoral agreements in this area. Now, of course, and there I would like to continue the debate about the antitrust law. There are a number of obstacles which actually prevent, gig workers, since we talk about them, to join social dialogue and let alone collective bargaining. Why? Several antitrust laws or competition legislation prohibit, for instance, freelancers. Remember the story before about, this company wanted to transform these contracts from regular contracts to freelancers? Okay. So freelancers are very often, in many legislation, prohibited from forming organizations and negotiating because this is considered as a cartel. Okay, first obstacle. Second obstacle, these workers being migrant workers, so very precarious ones, they don't have many incentives in joining a union. Sometimes they don't even want to declare themselves in the authorities. They don't have an ID. And of course, not to mention the question of geographical dispersion of these workers. If we talk about web-based online, type of platforms. And third obstacle, and very important one, is that many of these platforms do not define themselves as employers. They define themselves as intermediaries. So actually, they don't want to play the game. They don't want to be in the system. They want to operate in the margins of the system. So, and the question is, how do we convince these, let's say, platforms to be part of employers' organizations? I will finish, if you give me one more minute, Marily, with the role of international cooperation, which I think is the third piece of the puzzle for the day after. International cooperation is extremely important when it comes to regulating platforms. Why? Because especially online web-based platforms operate all over the world. So they are across multiple jurisdictions. So we need international cooperation and, if possible, regulation. And we need the universal common standards that apply equally to all businesses, all platforms, all workers, independently if they are freelancers, defined of freelancers, if they're based in Asia, in America. This is a cross-border issue that needs to be regulated in a cross-border manner. And the Global Commission on the Future of Work, which was an independent commission set up by the ILO in 2019 for the centenary of the ILO, pointed to a possible model which should inspire us in regulating transnationally the question of digital labor platforms, namely the International Maritime Labor Convention. Exactly in the same way when maritime workers are on the high seas that do not belong in any particular jurisdiction, and yet they are covered by a cross-border standards, the International Maritime Labor Convention, protecting their working conditions, their wages, etc., etc. Exactly in the same way, we need to devise an international governance system, which, of course, will also allow for gig workers and the platforms also to negotiate in a transnational manner. Exactly also as in the case of maritime transport regulation, where not only we have the International Maritime Labour Convention in the ILO, but in addition to this, we have also workers and employers in this sector negotiating with them, and it is the only global sectoral agreement that exists to date. Sorry for being long.
Azita, what do you think?
Thank you, Maria, for this question and for moderating this panel. Very interesting, and greetings to raising very many important issues, with some of which I really agree, and some of which needs a longer debate or another panel discussion soon, I think. But let me say a couple of words, and I would say all this discussion shows us that there is a choice, that there isn't a deterministic approach to technology. And obviously, we can leverage the opportunities and the challenges that have been enumerated. Right now, in this polarized, unequal world, the challenges overcome the opportunities, and it shouldn't be that we need to forego the opportunities because of this terrible socioeconomic situation that we are living through and the insecurity that is associated with it. So I really think that the important message is that there are ways of doing what Kostas has just mentioned in terms of reimagining this social dialogue and social institutions, including by leveraging digital technologies in a way that correspond to the realities and challenges posed by new technologies and transformation. Obviously, there are lots of political economy issues behind this, why these are not happening, and what is the bargaining power or market power of any of these stakeholders. So I really think that I would want to carry home that a regulatory framework, a fair regulatory framework, and also policies to support just transitions, including with the environmental crisis, are key to make a better buy-in in this very large scale and large scope transformation that we are living through. But I also want to highlight what also the end of the story of Kostas on that platform economy, the cancel hashtag. Citizens, workers have the possibility of giving their views, of reacting, and in particular, the way that I had emphasized, youth are a key actor in this framework. So we should not accept the way these technologies have been introduced. There are alternative ways, and that's very much what I wanted to emphasize. But also, I really need to say how much I appreciated the metaphor of accordion that Simone put forward, and the very important discussion on migration that links in a way future of work and global mobility with democracy, is this notion of that any new social contract that does not give the proper rights and space for migrant workers is going to be not sustainable and not livable. And I will really leave it at that.
So I think that the need to reimagine our labor markets are related to the need to reimagine our workplace and actually our working spaces, because the emphasis so far has been on gig workers, how the employer-employee relationship is changing. But with all this rise of remote work and teleworking, we are now talking about basically workplace-less employees. So I would like to introduce you a new perspective. I would like to invite you to see the interplay between the future of work and the future of living. And for that, we have Alexander Hedazi joining us today from the University of Geneva. Alexander, if you would like to very briefly introduce your ideas and work.
Sure. Thank you very much, Marilee, and thank you for this invitation. I'm humbled to join such a comprehensive and rich debate on the future of work and digital economy. And honestly, I was wondering what a city planner or architect can bring to this debate. But as you said, we are all, and listening to all of you, I see a confirmation of my first thoughts that we are on the same front in terms of the well-being of the citizens. And when it comes to well-being of the employees and those who are at the workplace, obviously our changing or transition towards a different society has its impact on the spaces we live in, the spaces we work in, and also brings into this debate the fundamental elements that our colleague Professor Baglioni brought to our attention, which is the issue of citizenship and democratic rule, and how we can participate in the setting up of those new or next living spaces and working places. So my presentation, if you allow me, and I saw the sign that we have 10 minutes left, probably 8 by now, it's to share a few visuals and a few slides with you that illustrate the way we want to bring in these issues of citizenship, these issues of inclusiveness, as well as mobility. And I want to share with you these elements because they are fundamental when it comes also to mobility, the issue of mobility that we discussed. So if I can just go to your... These are the fundamental elements that we all agree on. The future of the cities, including the working spaces and workspaces and places, are about our agreement that the cities of 21st century are going to be places of learning, will remain to be places of mercantile commerce, places of training in hybrid thinking and approaches that couple scientific knowledge and local practices. Obviously, indigenous understandings and practices extremely important, and that again confirms what we said in terms of the myth of globalization. Places of training as well as in virtues of patience, and that's very important for us to take stock of, as well as places of innovation and craft, reuse, reinventing, recentering of human places. And obviously, the most important thing that we see within my field is the prominence of proximity. As the time is short, I will jump over some of these slides, but bring you to your attention the importance of some of these new concepts from the planning perspective, city urban design, where we put the emphasis in my field on participation. We want citizens to be involved in the process of co-defining the problems, including the places of living and working, and come up with solutions. And that is the element that goes hand in hand with mobility. And here comes the whole plethora of concepts from cities of participations, the city in your pocket, the city that speaks, the passenger city, directed energies, and also the whole issue of hacking the city. So what is the fundamental element behind all this? And mobility is, once again, brings us to the reality on the ground. I'm very palpable as an urban planner and city planner when it comes to nitty-gritty details. It's data. What kind of data we have at our disposal to inform us on these places and spaces of work workplaces, and what are the desired and need aspiration of the labor and those who are working these places. The challenges that I see in terms of data is in terms of data collection, the cost, systemic, reliable, complete, and timely data costs, and therefore we need to acknowledge that when it comes to imagining and also implementing some of the strategies of upgrading some of these work spaces. The time to market versus obsolescence, and the scale. The question of scale is tremendously important when it comes to data. For example, in the case of housing, it's very difficult to have enough resolution to appropriately inform the policymakers. Involving citizens as sensors is another element that we would definitely bring into the reality on the ground when it comes to crafting new spaces or imagining new spaces. And the plethora of applications that inform us on the issues that citizens can have can be also adjusted or adapted to the workplace to inform us on what is not working or what is the real need of the population. And I end up on these challenges because I see that there's 5 minutes left. When we wanted the democratic rule and the role of citizens in bringing in their voice to the workplace, we are facing these 4 main challenges. The incentive structure. When I listen to you, I just wonder, how do you want the workers to be more proactive in bringing in their voice, considering the operational cost that is shifted to users, and we saw it with the example of Greece. Time, attention, knowledge, space on their mobile phone or battery, you name it. These are the costs that we are transferring. The quality of data is another challenge for the citizen-based data collection. Strict interface constraints versus qualitative data, as well as critical mass of data. Useful data resolution is very important, but only achievable if enough people are convinced to adopt the tools. And finally, the political cost of citizen-based data collection, which is about localities sometimes do not like systematic accounting and visualization of their performances, or even more importantly, of the problems that the citizens are facing. So the strongest incentive here for citizens to voice their concern and their needs when it comes to their living and working spaces is about the impact. Citizens obviously drop out when they see the data they input has no impact. And localities drop out when they see citizens do not care report enough. So these 2 elements need to be factored in not only imagining, but also coming up with these new formats and spaces of living and working that we are envisaging. And I include on this last slide, which help us to design the priorities in terms of imagining and designing new spaces of living and working from the technocratic-based approach to creating these spaces, design system, deploying systems, or incentivizing institutions to adopt some systems, and praying at the end of the day it works, which at the end has been resulted into a decline of initial bursts of some of these strategies, spotty, low resolution data, and therefore low impact policy or less quality when it comes to working places, lower initial political costs and higher maintenance costs, and go towards what we believe is the way forward, which is trust-based design. Design incentives that structure for local institutions and reduce their political risk. Design the system, which basically bringing in the systemic approach to those spaces. We cannot separate the working space from the living space, and therefore bringing the proximity issue. Check feedback loops, which are tremendously important in places for deploying those systems, and therefore aim the final result, which is satisfaction, lead to steady use of those spaces, and bringing in also something that I didn't mention here on this slide, the disenfranchised, who have no voice until now to express themselves on the places the kind of places they would like to live in and work in. And basically that what we see as many opportunities, but also challenges of moving towards this mobile lifestyle. But nevertheless, a mobile lifestyle and mobile places adapted to those mobile lifestyle that are bringing or materializing the well-being of the citizens.
Excellent. Questions? You can open the floor to get some questions from the audience here. Michelle, we don't have any questions from our online audience? Nothing. From here? Okay, final remarks then. 2-3 words. Felipe?
2-3 words. I wanted to build on this idea of protests and mobilization and hacking the city and taking over the public space and questions of trust. I mean, I mentioned earlier sort of this idea of seizing the algorithm. It's not an academic creation. People are doing this already, so-called algorithmic activism, right? I could witness this firsthand in Accra, where the algorithm was actually used to subvert its very disciplining logics. Uber drivers deployed the algorithm to organize a strike against the company itself. There are other examples across the world around this idea. Same with, notwithstanding how we tend to characterize these workers, they are fairly well organized and highly active WhatsApp online groups where questions of solidarity come to the fore very clearly. So I think that despite the cutthroat environment with which this sharing economy is often described, or the gig economy, these instances as the flip side of the kind of unilateral control imposed by labor platforms opens an important reflection, I think, on the potential of platform cooperativism, digital platform cooperativism, the exercise of democracy that's already happening in some of these workplaces, and maybe opening a conversation. What would it mean to own the digital means of production, and how we can exert greater forms of democratic control over the use, access, transferability, ownership of digital data. So maybe that's how I would conclude for the sake of time.
I think this is very close to your line.
This is indeed very close. I think I'm just going to build on that. Indeed, I think what can be something to explore is to use this bottom-up mobilization not only for protest, although these can be extremely powerful instances, of course, but then indeed also to keep up the organization and institutionalize it in the form and following principles of social and solidarity economy, such as cooperatives. There are already plenty of examples of platform cooperatives where basically you can just imagine Uber in a city being owned and controlled by the drivers themselves. This also exists in caring services. This exists in delivery services, in general services, in art, in photography. Basically, these models, digital platforms, are very close, are technologies that lend themselves very, very well to a solidarity-based organization and institutionalization. Especially also to manage data, again, to protect privacy, to also secure rights in data, such as the portability of data, if ever you want to switch to a different platform. And I think these not only, and this is also a great opportunity in this, not only limit themselves to the formal economy or what we consider the formal economy, but basically also can include people who do not have papers, who do not have the documentation, but basically are open to all kinds of people. So I think this is something to explore. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I would like to end this formally with a quote by Albert Hirschman. And the question then to a very briefly, very short question. So Albert Hirschman once said that creativity always comes as a surprise to us. Therefore, we cannot count on it or believe in it until it has happened. So I want Simone to close this discussion today. How can we instill more creativity into the future of work?
Oh, wow. I won't answer that question, Maria. I would say this is a too big question, especially after that quote. I just want to say that, or maybe try to answer by saying that I agree on what it has been just said on the power of mobilization and eventually the social economy. But I'm one of those who really claim for the power of, of policy and politics. And I really think we need to regain policy acumen to, deal and tackle with the effect of turbo capitalism. which we have lost. Azita before mentioned the Trente Glorieuses, and I think we were living in those decades, a time in which there was policy acumen, to foresee the events, the consequences of capitalism, while there has been a huge bifurcation in the last decades in which capitalism has run very fast along its way, while policy acumen hasn't really been up to the task. So I think really we need to regain that. It may be solicited, it may be fostered, pushed forward by the action you mentioned, and perhaps even by the youth and the young people, which was another, I think, very important aspect of Azita's speech, which in my mind really coupled with the role of migrants, young people and migrants as being the under considered aspects or subjects of our democracies and citizenship. So nowadays for climate change issues, we see actually that there is hope coming from the young generation and the action of young people, but let's hope it really translates into more broadly policy action. But thank you for this invitation and very inspiring
thank you very much. Kostas, you want to have a...
Very quickly, just it will take 30 seconds. First of all, just to advertise a publication of the ILO, which is the World Employment and Social Outlook 2021, which focused specifically on the role of digital labor platforms in the transformation of the world of work. And perhaps, since you said 2 words for the ending, I think there is an interesting citation by the Director General when he launched this publication. It was, what is unacceptable in the analog workplace should also be unacceptable in the digital workplace. And I think this is what should driven both our research and both policies and regulation in the post-pandemic.
Now ending is our beginning, as T.S. Eliot once said. Thank you all so much, Azita. Thank you so much for joining us from Cairo, for your very insightful keynote speech. I thank Kostas, Felipe, Alexander, and Sam. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you.